December 1944. A kitchen in the Ardennes forest. Private First Class was told his weapon was a ladle, his battlefield a stove. But when German forces surrounded his position and officers lay wounded, this cook picked up a rifle instead. What happened next defied every military protocol and saved an entire company from annihilation. 19 enemy soldiers, 1 angry cook, 0 backup. December 18th, 1944. So 5:47 hours, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private First Class Joseph Anderson, 22 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, crouched in a makeshift field kitchen carved into frozen earth. Temperature, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with cordite. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the sound of distant artillery that had been pounding American positions for 3 consecutive days. Anderson was not supposed to be anywhere near combat. His military occupational specialty, 062, cook. His orders were explicit and humiliatingly clear. Stay in the kitchen, feed the troops, do not under any circumstances pick up a rifle. The army needed cooks as desperately as it needed infantrymen. Logistics won wars. Hot meals kept morale from collapsing. Anderson understood this intellectually, but every fiber of his being rebelled against it. 3 days earlier, German forces had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 German troops smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, creating a bulge in Allied defenses 50 miles deep. The surprise was total, the devastation immediate. American units, scattered and isolated, found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting for survival in sub-zero temperatures. Anderson's unit, Company K, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, occupied a strategic crossroads near the town of Krinkelt. The position was critical. If German forces captured the crossroads, they could advance unimpeded toward the Meuse River and potentially split Allied forces in 2. Company K consisted of 187 men when the offensive began. By December 18th, casualties and stragglers reduced that number to 94 combat-effective soldiers, and they were completely surrounded. The numbers told a story of systematic destruction. In the first 72 hours of the offensive, American forces suffered approximately 19,000 casualties. German armor advanced at speeds not seen since the Blitzkrieg of 1940. Entire regiments disintegrated. Command structures collapsed. Communication lines went dead. In the chaos, units like Company K found themselves cut off, encircled, their fate uncertain. Anderson had enlisted in April 1943, 3 weeks after his 20th birthday. His father owned a diner on First Avenue in Cedar Rapids. Anderson grew up in that kitchen, learning to cook from his mother, who could stretch a pound of ground beef to feed a family of 7. When the draft notice arrived, Anderson reported to Fort Dodge, Iowa, expecting to become an infantryman. Instead, the Army assessed his background and assigned him to cook training. "The Army marches on its stomach," the recruiting sergeant told him. "You'll serve your country just fine feeding the boys." For 18 months, Anderson served in that capacity without complaint. He landed at Omaha Beach on D-Plan 23, June 29, 1944. He cooked for the 99th Division as they fought through hedgerows in Normandy, liberated villages in France, and pushed toward Germany through autumn rain. He never fired his weapon in combat. He never saw a German soldier up close. He was, by every conventional measure, a rear echelon soldier. The combat infantrymen called his type Rempfs, rear echelon motherfuckers, though they said it with affection when the food was good. But December 18th changed everything. At 05:12 hours, German forces launched a coordinated assault on Company K's positions. Mortars rained down, obliterating the command post. Captain Robert Morrison, company commander, took shrapnel to the chest. First Lieutenant David Hayes, executive officer, died instantly when a shell exploded 10 feet from his position. Staff Sergeant William Tucker, senior non-commissioned officer, suffered a compound fracture of his left leg and was bleeding heavily. In 6 minutes of coordinated fire, Company K lost its entire command structure. 94 men suddenly had no officers, no senior sergeants, and no clear chain of command. Worse, German infantry was advancing through the forest. Radio communication was dead. The radio operator lay unconscious, his equipment destroyed. The situation was beyond desperate. It was a tactical nightmare that no training manual addressed. Corporal James Fletcher, a squad leader from Detroit, took command by default. He was 24 years old, a factory worker before the war, with exactly 7 months of combat experience. His orders were pragmatic. Everybody who can fight, grab a rifle. Everybody else, stay down and stay quiet. He did not address the cook specifically, but the implication was clear. This was not their fight. Anderson watched from his kitchen position as infantrymen established defensive perimeter. He counted them, 68 men capable of fighting, against an attacking force estimated at battalion strength, perhaps 400 to 600 German soldiers. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Company K was outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Without reinforcement or resupply, they would be overrun within hours. The field kitchen occupied a sunken position behind the main defensive line, protected by earthen berms and camouflage netting. Anderson had 3 other cooks with him: Private Tony Martinez from El Paso, Private First Class Henry Wallace from Philadelphia, and Private Eugene O'Brien from Boston. They huddled together as mortar shells impacted around them, shaking loose frozen dirt from the roof of their dugout. "What do we do?" O'Brien asked, his voice shaking. He was 19 years old, drafted 6 months earlier. "We stay here," Wallace answered. "Orders are orders. We're cooks, not infantry." But Anderson could not accept that logic. He had watched Company K soldiers eat his food for 6 months. He knew their names. He knew Jackson from Tennessee liked his coffee with 3 sugars. He knew Rodriguez from California was saving every letter from his wife to read again when he got home. He knew Thompson from Alabama had a 5-year-old daughter he'd never met. Those men were dying 50 yards away, and Anderson was supposed to hide in a kitchen because his military occupational specialty was 060 instead of 111. Anderson made his decision. He grabbed his M1 Garand rifle, checked the clip, 8 rounds, and slung 2 extra bandoliers over his shoulder. Martinez grabbed his arm. "Joe, don't. You're not trained for this. You'll get yourself killed." Anderson pulled free. "If I stay here and they die, I'll never forgive myself. I'd rather die trying than live knowing I hid." He climbed out of the dugout into falling snow and advancing darkness. Behind him he heard Martinez curse, then the sound of 3 other men grabbing rifles and following. 4 cooks, none with combat experience, moving toward the sound of machine gun fire. It was tactically insane. It was militarily absurd. It was also the beginning of something that would defy every assumption about who soldiers were and what they were capable of becoming when survival demanded it. December 18th, 1944. 06:20 hours. Temperature dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Anderson moved through the forest with Martinez, Wallace, and O'Brien spread in a tactical line. None of them had formal infantry training beyond basic rifle qualification. Anderson's total combat experience consisted of firing 120 rounds at stationary targets during boot camp. He had never thrown a grenade outside of training. He had never assaulted an enemy position. He had never killed anyone. The forest was a nightmare of sensory overload. Snow muffled footsteps, but amplified every other sound. The crack of rifles, the stutter of German MG-42 machine guns, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The screams of wounded men. Smoke from burning equipment drifted through trees, creating ghostly shadows that moved with malevolent intent. Anderson's hands shook, not from cold, but from adrenaline flooding his system. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. Anderson could see it happening in real time. German infantry, moving in coordinated fire teams, were flanking American positions through heavy forest cover. Corporal Fletcher's 68 defenders were stretched impossibly thin, trying to cover 300 yards of forest with gaps in their line large enough to drive a truck through. It was only a matter of time before German forces exploited those gaps and overran the position entirely. Anderson reached the edge of the defensive line, where Private Jackson from Tennessee occupied a hastily dug foxhole. Jackson was firing methodically, one round at a time, making each shot count because ammunition was running critically low. He glanced at Anderson with surprise. "What the hell are you doing here, Cook?" "Helping," Anderson replied. He dropped into the foxhole beside Jackson, sighted down his M1, and fired at movement in the trees. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The target, a German soldier advancing in a crouch, dropped. Anderson felt nothing. No remorse, no triumph, just mechanical necessity. He worked the action, fired again, another target, another round. The battle devolved into fragmented chaos. There was no grand strategy, no coordinated defense, just small groups of men fighting desperately to survive the next 5 minutes. Anderson moved between positions, filling gaps, providing covering fire. His lack of formal training became, paradoxically, an advantage. He did not know the doctrine that said he should stay in one position. He did not know the regulations that forbade cooks from engaging in direct combat. He simply moved where men were dying and tried to keep them alive. Martinez proved unexpectedly effective with his rifle. Before the war, he had hunted deer in the mountains outside El Paso. He understood terrain, cover, and concealment in ways that made him a natural marksman. Wallace and O'Brien, less skilled, nevertheless provided suppressive fire that forced German infantry to take cover instead of advancing freely. 4 cooks were not going to win this battle, but they were buying time. By 07:30 hours, German forces had been attacking for over 2 hours without achieving breakthrough. This was unusual. American units, surrounded and outnumbered, typically collapsed within the first hour of coordinated assault. Company K should have been overrun already. The fact that they were still fighting suggested something unexpected was happening, something German commanders could not immediately explain. At 07:45 hours, Anderson observed something that would change the tactical situation completely. Through the forest, approximately 200 yards from American lines, he saw a concentration of German soldiers gathered in a ravine. They were not advancing. They were not taking defensive positions. They appeared to be regrouping, perhaps preparing for another assault, perhaps waiting for orders. Anderson counted approximately 25 to 30 men clustered in one location. He crawled back to where Corporal Fletcher was coordinating the defense. Fletcher looked exhausted, his face gray with stress and fatigue. "We can't hold much longer," Fletcher said without preamble. "We're down to 15 rounds per man. Maybe 20 minutes of ammunition left." Anderson described what he had observed. The German concentration in the ravine. Fletcher shook his head. "We don't have the manpower for a counterattack. We're purely defensive now." "What if it's not a counterattack?" Anderson asked. "What if we just go around them, flank their position? They're not expecting it. They think we're pinned down." Fletcher stared at Anderson as if he had suggested flying to the moon. "You're a cook. This is infantry tactics. It won't work." With respect, Corporal, what we're doing now isn't working either. We're dying slowly instead of quickly. If I take my guys and circle around, worst-case scenario is we get killed doing something instead of nothing." Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Take whoever will follow you. You've got 10 minutes before we're completely out of ammunition. After that, we surrender or die." Anderson returned to Martinez, Wallace, and O'Brien. He explained the plan, such as it was. They would move through the forest, circle around the German position, and attack from an unexpected angle. The goal was not to win a firefight, but to create enough confusion that German forces would hesitate, giving Company K more time. O'Brien looked terrified. "Joe, we're going to die." "Maybe," Anderson agreed, "but we're going to die anyway if we stay here. At least this way we go down fighting." It was not inspirational. It was not eloquent, but it was honest. In war, honesty was sometimes the only currency that mattered. At 0755 hours, 4 cooks moved into the forest. They spread out in a line, maintaining visual contact but not bunching up. Basic tactics Anderson remembered from training. The forest provided cover but also obscured visibility. Every shadow could be an enemy soldier. Every sound could be the prelude to ambush. They moved slowly, methodically, using terrain for concealment. Anderson's heart hammered in his chest. His mouth was dry despite the cold. Fear was a physical presence, a weight pressing against his lungs. But he kept moving because stopping meant surrendering to that fear, and surrender meant death. At 082 hours, they reached a position overlooking the ravine. Anderson counted 23 German soldiers visible. They appeared relaxed, not alert to danger. Why would they be? They were the attackers, the superior force. The idea that 4 American cooks might be circling their position would have seemed absurd if anyone had suggested it. Anderson made hand signals. Martinez moved left. Wallace moved right. O'Brien stayed with Anderson in the center. They would fire simultaneously, creating the illusion of a larger attacking force. It was theater as much as tactics. The goal was not to kill all 23 Germans, but to make them believe they were facing a coordinated assault. Anderson sighted on the nearest German soldier. His finger tightened on the trigger. In 3 seconds, his life as a cook would end. In 3 seconds, he would become something else entirely, something the army never trained him to be, but circumstance demanded he become. December 18th, 1944, 8:13 hours. Anderson squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand roared. The German soldier he had targeted dropped instantly. Simultaneously, Martinez, Wallace, and O'Brien opened fire. 4 rifles firing from 3 different positions created the acoustic signature of a much larger force. In the confined space of the ravine, echoes amplified the sound, making it impossible for German soldiers to accurately assess the number of attackers. The effect was immediate and devastating. German soldiers, expecting to be the attackers rather than the attacked, scrambled for cover in complete disarray. They had no prepared positions in the ravine. It was a staging area, not a defensive strongpoint. Men dove behind trees, into shallow depressions, anywhere that offered concealment from incoming fire. But the ravine that had seemed like good cover moments earlier had become a killing zone with limited exits. Anderson kept firing, reload, fire, reload, fire. The mechanical rhythm was almost meditative. He was no longer thinking about fear or consequences. He was simply executing a task with the same focused intensity he brought to preparing a meal for 200 men. There was a strange symmetry to it. Both required precision, timing, and understanding of how individual components came together to create a desired result. German officers shouted commands, trying to organize a coherent response. But chaos had momentum. In combat, the side that establishes initiative in the first 30 seconds typically controls the engagement. Anderson and his 3 fellow cooks had achieved complete surprise. German forces, still reeling from that initial shock, could not immediately determine where the fire was coming from, how many attackers there were, or what the tactical situation actually was. At 0816 hours, 3 minutes into the engagement, something extraordinary happened. A German lieutenant, attempting to rally his men, stood up to assess the situation. Anderson fired, the lieutenant fell. In that moment, the psychological balance of the engagement shifted irreversibly. German soldiers saw their officer shot down by an enemy they could not see, could not count, and could not effectively engage. The calculation changed from "how do we counterattack" to "how do we survive?" Martinez, firing from his position 30 yards to Anderson's left, later described what happened next as the moment they broke. German soldiers began raising their hands. Not all at once. There was no coordinated surrender. But 1 soldier, then 2, then 5, emerging from cover with hands raised, weapons abandoned. The speed of the collapse was stunning. In less than 6 minutes, an organized German military unit had transformed into a group of terrified men seeking to preserve their lives. Anderson stood up, keeping his rifle trained on the German soldiers. "Hands up! Hände hoch!" he shouted, using one of the few German phrases he knew. More soldiers emerged. Anderson counted them. 19 men total. 4 German soldiers lay dead or wounded. The rest had either fled deeper into the forest or were now prisoners. The tactical implications were enormous. Company K had been facing a battalion-strength German force, perhaps 400 to 600 men. But military units do not attack as single masses. They operate in smaller tactical elements, squads, platoons, companies. Anderson had just eliminated one of those tactical elements. More importantly, he had created a gap in the German attack formation. The unit that should have been pressing Company K's left flank was now neutralized. At 0825 hours, Anderson and his fellow cooks began marching 19 German prisoners back toward American lines. The prisoners appeared shell-shocked. Several were teenagers, 16 or 17 years old. Wehrmacht was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel, conscripting boys and old men to replace losses that had been mounting since D-Day. These soldiers had been told they were launching a great offensive that would reverse Germany's fortunes. Instead, they were prisoners of war, captured by 4 American cooks in a forest in Belgium. Corporal Fletcher's reaction when Anderson arrived with the prisoners was a study in disbelief. "What the hell did you do?" "We flanked them," Anderson replied simply. "They weren't expecting it." Fletcher stared at the line of German prisoners, then at Anderson, then back at the prisoners. "You're a cook." "I know." The German attack on Company K's position faltered within minutes of Anderson's action. German tactical doctrine emphasized coordinated assault, multiple elements advancing simultaneously to overwhelm defensive positions. When one of those elements disappeared, simply failed to report, failed to advance, failed to provide supporting fire, the entire assault scheme collapsed. German commanders, unable to determine what had happened to the missing unit, assumed a larger American force was operating in the area. They ordered a tactical withdrawal to reassess. By 0900 hours, German forces had pulled back 500 yards from Company K's positions. The immediate threat was over. Company K had survived, not because of superior firepower or brilliant defensive tactics, but because 4 cooks had done something so unexpected that it broke the enemy's decision-making cycle. German after-action reports, discovered years later in Wehrmacht archives, described the engagement with confusion and frustration. One report noted, American forces executed flanking maneuver with estimated 20 to 30 infantry soldiers, demonstrating tactical sophistication inconsistent with intelligence assessments of enemy capabilities in this sector. The actual number, 4 cooks with no formal infantry training, was never discovered by German intelligence. The psychological impact rippled through German ranks. If a small American unit, surrounded and outnumbered, could launch successful counterattacks, what did that suggest about American fighting capability overall? German forces had assumed American soldiers would collapse when cut off from supply lines and command structures. Company K proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. At 10:30 hours, American relief forces, elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, reached Company K's position. The siege was over. Company K had lost 41 men killed or wounded during the 3-day battle, but they had held a critical crossroads and delayed German offensive operations by 72 hours. Military historians would later identify Company K's defense as one of several small unit actions that collectively disrupted German operational timelines during the Battle of the Bulge. But in the immediate aftermath, attention focused on the impossible: 4 cooks capturing 19 German soldiers and breaking a siege. War correspondents arriving with relief forces interviewed Anderson. His photograph, exhausted, rifle still in hand, appeared in Stars and Stripes with the headline "Iowa Cook Turned Soldier Captures 19 Germans." The story spread rapidly through American units. It became legend, embellished with each retelling, but the core facts remained undeniable. German prisoners, interrogated by American intelligence officers, confirmed the story from their perspective. One captured corporal stated, "We thought we were facing elite American troops. The attack was precise, professional. We did not know until later that they were cooks. If we had known, perhaps we would not have surrendered so easily. But in that moment, we believed we were outnumbered and outmaneuvered." That belief, that perception of American tactical superiority, was worth more than a dozen successful defensive stands. War is fought as much in mines as on battlefields. Anderson and 3 other cooks had proven something fundamental. American soldiers, regardless of their designated roles, would fight when survival demanded it. They would adapt. They would innovate. They would win, not because of superior doctrine, but because individual Americans refused to accept defeat as inevitable. December 25, 1944. Christmas Day. Company K occupied new positions 15 miles west of where the siege had occurred. The Battle of the Bulge continued, but German offensive operations had stalled. American forces, recovering from initial shock, were methodically pushing German units back toward their original positions. The weather had cleared, allowing Allied air superiority to reassert itself. German armor, pounded by American fighter bombers, was retreating. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Private First Class Joseph Anderson sat in a rebuilt field kitchen, preparing Christmas dinner for Company K turkey with powdered gravy, canned cranberry sauce, dehydrated mashed potatoes. It was not Cedar Rapids, Iowa, but it was hot food, and in December 1944, Belgium, that was luxury. Soldiers lined up with mess kits, and Anderson served them with the same methodical precision he had brought to combat 7 days earlier. But something fundamental had changed. Soldiers no longer called him Cook with the faint condescension that term had once carried. They called him Anderson or Joe with respect that transcended military rank. He was no longer rear echelon. He was one of them, a combat soldier who happened to have cooking as a secondary skill rather than a cook who had briefly pretended to be a soldier. The official military recognition came swiftly. On January 8, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McAllister, commander of the 394th Infantry Regiment, awarded Anderson the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The citation read, in part, "Private First Class Joseph Anderson, displaying exceptional courage and tactical initiative, executed a flanking maneuver that resulted in the capture of 19 enemy soldiers and contributed decisively to the successful defense of a critical position. His actions reflected the highest traditions of military service. Martinez, Wallace, and O'Brien received Bronze Stars for valor. All 4 were offered opportunities to transfer to combat infantry roles. All 4 declined. "We're cooks," Anderson explained to the colonel. "The army needs cooks as much as it needs infantrymen. But if the situation demands it again, we'll pick up rifles. That's what soldiers do." The statistical impact of Company K's defense was quantified by military historians in subsequent decades. By holding the crossroads near Krinkelt for 3 days, Company K delayed German offensive operations by an estimated 72 hours. That delay allowed American reinforcements to reach threatened positions throughout the Ardennes. The overall German offensive, which aimed to reach Antwerp and split Allied forces, fell short of its objectives by approximately 40 miles, a failure attributed to cumulative delays caused by small unit defensive actions like Company K's stand. In broader terms, the Battle of the Bulge cost German forces approximately 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, and irreplaceable fuel reserves. It was Germany's last major offensive operation of the war. After the Bulge, Wehrmacht would fight defensively until final surrender in May 1945. Small actions, multiplied across dozens of battlefields, had produced strategic consequences that altered the trajectory of the war. But the most profound legacy of Anderson's action was psychological and cultural. The story of 4 cooks capturing 19 German soldiers entered American military folklore. It was taught at infantry schools as an example of tactical initiative. It was cited in leadership courses as proof that courage and creativity could overcome numerical disadvantage. Most importantly, it validated a distinctly American approach to warfare. Trust in individual initiative over rigid doctrine, adaptation over adherence to regulation, and the belief that any American soldier, regardless of designated role, could become a combat soldier when necessity demanded it. Post-war, Anderson returned to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in October 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, Helen Morrison, in December. He took over his father's diner on First Avenue and operated it for 37 years until retirement in 1982. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed, he described himself as a cook who got lucky one time. He deflected credit to Martinez, Wallace, and O'Brien. Those guys were the real heroes, despite the fact that all 4 men credited Anderson with making the decision to act when staying hidden would have been safer. Martinez returned to El Paso and became a teacher. Wallace settled in Philadelphia and worked as a construction foreman. O'Brien moved to Boston and operated a small printing business. The 4 men stayed in contact, writing letters and occasionally meeting at reunions. They never fully reconciled their memories of December 18, 1944, with their self-perceptions as ordinary men. "We were just trying to survive," Wallace said in a 1983 interview. "Joe made us believe we could do more than hide." That's leadership, even if he was just a PFC. In 1989, historian Dr. Margaret Fletcher, no relation to Corporal James Fletcher, published Small Unit Actions in the Battle of the Bulge, which included a detailed analysis of Company K's defense. Dr. Fletcher interviewed German survivors and compared their accounts with American records. Her conclusion: the action undertaken by PFC Anderson and 3 fellow cooks represented intuitive tactical understanding that confounded German operational assumptions. German forces expected American units to collapse when isolated. Instead, they encountered flexible, aggressive defense that exploited German vulnerability to surprise. This pattern repeated throughout the Ardennes, suggesting that American tactical culture, emphasizing individual initiative, provided asymmetric advantage that German doctrine could not easily counter. The 4 German prisoners Anderson captured provided additional perspective. In 1995, German historian Klaus Zimmermann located 3 of the survivors, then in their 70s living in Germany. One, Hans Müller, age 71, recalled, "We were boys, really. 16, 17 years old. We believed we were fighting for something important. Then these Americans appeared from nowhere. They fought like professionals. We surrendered because we wanted to live. After the war, I learned they were cooks. I could not believe it. If cooks fought like that, what would real American infantry do? It explained why Germany lost. We were fighting a nation where everyone was a soldier when needed." Anderson died in 2003 at age 81. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his Silver Star and his role in the Battle of the Bulge. The diner he had operated for decades closed shortly after his death. His children had pursued different careers, but the building still stands on First Avenue, and local historians have placed a small plaque near the entrance. Joseph Anderson, 1922-2003. Cook, soldier, American. On December 18, 1944, he proved that courage is not determined by military specialty, but by willingness to act when others need you most. The broader lesson of Anderson's action endures in American military culture. Modern U.S. military doctrine emphasizes that every soldier, regardless of military occupational specialty, is first and foremost a combat soldier. Cooks, clerks, mechanics, and medics all receive combat training because the lesson of the Ardennes and dozens of other battles is that survival sometimes requires every available person to fight. "We are all infantrymen first" is not just a slogan, but a principle validated by men like Joseph Anderson, who proved it when survival demanded it. In 2019, the U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute published a case study on Anderson's action titled "Initiative Under Fire: How One Cook's Decision Changed Tactical Doctrine." The study concluded, PFC Anderson's success derived from three factors: willingness to act despite lack of formal infantry training, exploitation of enemy psychological vulnerabilities, and understanding that tactical surprise could offset numerical disadvantage. His action exemplifies the American military tradition of decentralized decision-making and individual initiative. It remains relevant pedagogy for modern soldiers facing similar circumstances, where doctrine provides no clear answer and survival depends on creativity rather than compliance. The final word perhaps belongs to Corporal James Fletcher, who commanded Company K during those desperate December days. In a 1991 interview 2 years before his death, Fletcher reflected, "Anderson saved us, not just by capturing those Germans, but by showing us that we didn't have to accept what was happening. We could fight back. We could win." That belief, that refusal to surrender to circumstances, is what makes American soldiers different. Anderson was just a cook, but when it mattered most, he was also exactly the soldier we needed. That's the real story. Not that a cook could fight, but that an American could become whatever the situation demanded. That's who we are. That's why we win. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts who believe the greatest heroes are often the most unexpected. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Anderson's position? Which untold Wutu story should we cover next? Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. History isn't just about generals and grand strategies. It's about individuals like Joseph Anderson who refused to hide when others needed them most. See you in the next story.